Welcome to the History of Hackers. This series highlights some of the pivotal moments in hacking history and how they've shaped the role of hackers in modern-day cybersecurity. The history of hackers challenges fundamental notions of right and wrong, and through this series, we'll take a look at how hacking blurs ethical lines. How did hacking become so prevalent? Why did hackers develop such a scary reputation? We'll answer these questions and more. To kick off this series, let's take you back to when the term hacker was first introduced. Where did the term hacker come from? It actually originated around 1955 at a prestigious school you may have heard of called the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. MIT students would make practical jokes or pull pranks on campus to demonstrate their cleverness, and those pranks became known as hacks. Subsequently, the students who pulled these hacks became known as hackers. Hacks that MIT students performed often involved decorating the Great Dome, a central building on MIT's campus. They turned it into R2-D2. They put a propeller hat on it. Some hackers even found a way to make a replica of a campus police car and put that on top of the dome. According to reports on the scene, the replica had a fake officer and a box of donuts inside. Early on, hacks were lighthearted and fun. Today, the definition of a hacker has evolved. Like every good coming-of-age story, this one is about innocence lost and the significance that hackers now have on the global security stage. As we discuss some of these important events in the history of hacking, I think you'll start to understand the line between right and wrong, between good and bad. It's more nuanced, and to some extent, right and wrong is decided by whoever holds the most power. At MIT, the first time hackers were connected to computing was in 1963. An article in The Tech, MIT's largest newspaper, described hackers that were abusing phone services. These hackers were tying up all the phone lines between Harvard and MIT, and they even found a way to make long-distance phone calls and charge them to a local radar installation. This caused MIT to shut down most of the phone lines that were available to the public and expel students that were repeat offenders. According to the article, MIT expelled one student the week before they graduated. You know that had to be a fun conversation with mom and dad. Now, MIT students weren't the first ones that manipulated phone systems. In fact, a whole culture was already being built around experimenting with ways to hack phone services, and it was called Phreaking. That takes us back to 1957, when an unlikely cult hero made an incredible discovery. The term phreaking was a play on the word freak that stole the PH from phone, and was used to describe hacking activity that specifically related to phones. Phreaking also referred to the various audio frequencies that individuals use to manipulate phone systems. Anyone who participated in the activity was known as a phreaker. Now, phreakers discovered some really ingenious hacks, but why did they want to hack phones in the first place? Back then, you couldn't just pick up the phone and call a friend across the country. It was a big ordeal. You had to make something called a long-distance call, and that process was complicated and expensive. So phreakers look for hacks to get out of paying these insanely expensive phone rates. What if I told you you could save a lot of money on your phone bill, and all you have to do is whistle? Sounds crazy, doesn't it? Well, that actually happened, and the story is fascinating. The person regarded as the father of phreaking was the one who made that discovery. And ironically, the father of phreaking was a 7-year-old named Joe Ingressia. An interesting thing to note, Joe Ingressia was blind. Perhaps he developed a keen sense of hearing to compensate, which made him uniquely qualified to make this discovery. What did he discover exactly? Joe Ingressia realized that if you whistle with a certain tone at a frequency of 2600 hertz, into your phone, you could hack the phone system and make free long distance and international calls. He didn't even realize what he had done. He actually called the phone company to find out what happened. Even if it was a case of blind luck, Joe and Grecia opened the floodgates for phreakers to take advantage of sound frequencies. Eventually, a phreaker named John Draper, who coincidentally was friends with Ingresia, realized a whistle that came in a box of cereal could produce that same frequency. Blow a toy whistle and boom, you get free long distance calls. Funny enough, that's how he ended up with the infamous nickname Captain Crunch. So after that, anyone could take advantage of this hack, even if they couldn't whistle to save their life. How many of us would have been buying a box of Captain Crunch? Yeah, I know I would have needed that toy. As Phreaking evolved further, tone generators, or blue boxes, were developed to make it even easier to produce these frequencies. These blue boxes were even developed and marketed by some people you might have heard of. Steve Jobs, Steve Wozniak? Yeah, that's right, the founders of Apple. The founders of the company that charge you $1,000 or more for a new phone were looking for ways to avoid phone charges back in the day. Now, there were many other types of phreaking, but they all had the same goal. Phreakers didn't want to pay for long-distance phone calls. This form of hacking seems relatively harmless, right? Who wouldn't want to save money on their phone bill? I mean, even today, phone companies are the bane of many people's existence. How many hours have you wasted listening to that god-awful hold music?
We're sorry. All of our representatives are still assisting other customers.
Just read some online reviews and you'll see exactly how people feel about phone companies. Phone companies have always made plenty of money. Should they really be considered a victim? Are they providing a vital service, or are they anti-competitive monopolists just trying to take every penny they can get? Eventually, phone companies were able to isolate their processes from the public to prevent hacking. But before that, you could end up being charged with toll fraud and end up in jail.
Keep the change, you filthy animal.
So this introduction of phreaking was when the line between right and wrong began to blur, and those ethical questions we talked about began to emerge. Who's right in this situation? Who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? In a complex scenario like this, it often depends on where your loyalties lie. I'm sure there are a lot of you who would side with the phreakers. It's a great underdog story. Their ingenuity was incredible. I mean, come on. A 7-year-old sticking it to the phone company? That's pretty sick. But maybe you own a small neighborhood business and your customers found a hack or a loophole to get out of paying for your services. That's taking money out of your pocket. Maybe you'd sympathize with the phone company's position. So which side are you on? Phreakers or phone companies? Leave your answer in the comments and tell us why. As a human, it's really important for us to consider both sides. This chapter in the history of hackers really illuminated the gray areas of right and wrong and foreshadowed potential problems that might come from hacking. That leads us to 1984 and an influential moment in hacker history, when the ethical question about hacking evolved from what's right and wrong to who or what can you trust. In 1984, a pioneer of computer science named Ken Thompson wrote a little 3-page paper that fundamentally shaped the hacker landscape, called Reflections on Trusting Trust. In 1983, he and his longtime partner at Bell Labs, Dennis Ritchie, won the prestigious ACM Turing Award, often referred to as the Nobel Prize for Computer Science, for their work on the first modern operating system, Unix. And Reflections on Trusting Trust was the lecture that Thompson gave as his acceptance speech for the award. Just to give you some perspective on how important these guys were, Thompson created the B programming language, the predecessor to C, which Ritchie created. Now, you might have heard of a little programming language called C++. That was built around their work. Thompson and Ritchie created systems that laid groundwork for much of the world's computing infrastructure. Your smartphone, computer, IoT devices, all of these technologies are influenced by their work. But why was Thompson's paper such a big moment in the history of hacking? After all, it's only 3 pages, not complex or highly technical, but let me explain. In Reflections on Trusting Trust, Thompson concludes, you can't trust code that you didn't totally create yourself, especially code from companies that employ people like me. No amount of source-level verification or scrutiny will protect you from using untrusted code. In the paper, he proved this to be true by using code he created himself and then using a Trojan horse to attack it. I'm sure many of you have heard of a Trojan horse virus. His paper popularized that term. The enduring significance of Reflections on Trusting Trust is that Thompson made the implicit explicit. There's a lot of trust required when using computers and software that other people build. At the time, it was feasible to write your own software from top to bottom. The bootloader that runs when a computer starts, the operating system, and even the program that you want to use. But as technology grew, that became an absurd proposition. You have to place trust in others, and not just a few others. Computers continually get more complex as new layers of technology infrastructure are introduced. Thompson also saw in advance the complicated ethics of unintentional versus deliberate harm and the associated legal significance. Later on in his summary, he implored Congress to crack down on hackers and update the criminal code. He accused the media of making heroes of vandals by portraying hackers as whiz kids. That's what a hacker originally was, right? Remember those clever MIT students? This is when the definition of a hacker started to change, and innocent pranks could start having serious ramifications. Technical security controls could no longer keep up with hackers. Companies now needed to rely on legal controls. And 2 years later, in 1986, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was passed by Congress to formally address hacking. Thompson's paper created a shift in perception. It raised important questions. It foreshadowed new criminal law. That's why it was a very influential moment in the history of hackers. And as this coming-of-age story progresses, you'll see that the innocence hackers once had slips further and further away. Thanks for joining us for part 1 of the history of hackers. Subscribe to our channel and keep an eye out for part 2, where we'll discuss the invention of a little thing we like to call the internet, which changed the stakes of hacking forever, as the world was introduced to the first big internet attack, the Morris worm.